Welcome everyone. Welcome to another episode of Chatting with Experts in the Field of Cultural Evolution. Today we have Dr. Cristine Legare. She's a professor of psychology and the director of the Center for Applied Cognitive Sciences at the University of Texas at Austin. Her research examines how the human mind enables us to learn, create, and transmit culture. So welcome, Cristine. How are you? Tell us
Thank
a little bit
you.
about yourself and about your work, and just take it from there.
Sure, happy to. Lovely to be here, and always happy to support the field of cultural evolution, which I think is the most exciting intellectual development in many years. So, a little bit about my work. I conduct global cognitive science,
Mm-hmm.
or cognitive science, with the objective of bringing together multiple disciplines, multiple sectors, in order to translate what we know about how the mind works to more effective and culturally sensitive social and behavioral change interventions of a variety of different sorts. So, broadly speaking, that's what I do. And I use cultural evolution as the primary theoretical framework for my work for a number of different reasons. Cultural evolution takes multiple different disciplinary perspectives, which is really, really helpful. I think tackling any core social challenge requires the theoretical and the methodological toolkit of multiple disciplines, social scientific, as well as the natural sciences are critical, engineering. So I like the inclusivity and the interdisciplinarity of cultural evolution, as well as the focus on application, which I think is timely and critical.
Do you take us through maybe if you could ground these things into some examples of what you've
Sure,
done, how it's been applicable, how cultural evolution has
sure,
directly played a role into that?
sure. So I'll give you an example of a project that we conducted in public health relatively recently that I think is a really nice example. And I can also chat a little bit about how cultural evolution provided, I think, really novel and critical insight into this particular project. So the project more generally is on maternal and child health. It's in Bihar, which is a state in northern India. And it's very populous. It's very culturally rich and diverse. There's also quite a few social challenges that the state's facing. And so our task was to better understand what I call cultural ecology of maternal and child health in that context. And many of the social and behavioral change initiatives globally have insufficiently considered the cultural complexity of the context that they're operating in. I think maybe behavioral economics might be kind of the culprit here. I love behavioral economics. It's super powerful, but it's just one tool in the toolbox. All disciplines are strong and weak in their own ways. This is why we need the theoretical and methodological richness of all the disciplines in order to do complex research on complex topics, complex species. So the previous work that had been done on this topic was very focused on surveys with one particular component of the community and not a lot of qualitative work, not a lot of consideration of the large number of different influencers, the complex belief systems in the space. So our goal was to map out the cultural ecology, and that involved more than just talking to mothers. That involved talking to their extended families, their partners, their husbands, the community health workers or ASHAs in this context that work in that environment, the members of the formal health system as well as the informal health system, to try to understand complex systems and how all of these different pieces fit together. And humans are pragmatic, and in their quest to try to procure resources to improve the health of their children, they seek out a great variety of different experts and resources. So a big part of what we're trying to understand is the broader network of organizations and individuals that support women and children and families in that context, to map out their beliefs and practices and rituals. Actually, my expertise in rituals is the reason the particular funder sought me out to conduct this research. There's growing
Sorry, just to
awareness.
clarify, you mean religious rituals or just general ritualized behavior?
General ritualized behavior. So religious ceremonies are beautiful examples of rituals, but all human organizations and groups of any size have rituals that are really behavioral programming of our species. And so we're documenting, for example, all of the health-related rituals that mothers engage in to reduce anxiety, to attempt to mitigate risk to health. I think we documented several dozen at least health-related rituals, some portion of which are part of the formal healthcare system, but a lot are part of the informal healthcare system. And people use both. People use whatever resources are at their disposal. And there are strengths of the formal healthcare system, but there are also pretty substantial limitations. So understanding how all these pieces fit together is really critical in order to attempt to understand how to intervene best. And cultural evolution is one of the many, many reasons I find it so powerful is that there's a huge emphasis on functionality. So what do these different practices, beliefs, for example, what functions do they serve? What psychological functions do they serve? What social functions do they serve? Cultural functions do they serve? We need to understand all of those. We need answers to those questions in order to understand the cultural ecology, for example.
Can I ask, when you mean like health related, like how mothers use health related rituals, etc., is it just for their health, or is it for the health of the child as well? Is it
It's
like
largely for the health of the child, right? There's so both of course, but a huge portion of the ritualized practices that they're engaging in are meant to protect the health of the baby, to prevent birth defects, to avoid stillbirth and miscarriage, and all kinds of concerns that that pregnant women are facing. And there's a huge amount of interest in attempting to get women to engage in behaviors that are biomedically recommended or are recommended based on biomedical research without understanding the existing beliefs and practices, without focusing sufficient attention on the concerns that mothers have. As it turns out, mothers are very cautious about what they put into their bodies when they're pregnant for very, very good reasons. There's a lot of beautiful research
absolutely.
in cultural evolution about why we would have biases, to be especially cautious about what we put into our bodies. So when doctors who come from communities we're not familiar with, doctors are community health workers, it's typically not the doctors themselves, community health workers who come into communities and say, these are IFA tablets, they have iron and folic acid, and you should take them to prevent birth defects, without any of the cultural translation necessary to convince mothers to take these pills, which are large. I mean, they're large. They have a number of consequences on your intestinal tract. They require some embedding in belief systems that currently exist. It's also essential to reduce concerns that mothers have about taking substances that they are unfamiliar with. So basic levels of cultural translation often don't occur, and documenting existing beliefs and practices are an essential part of what's required for effective social and behavioral change initiatives. This makes total sense to someone trained in cultural evolution, but
Absolutely.
much of the field of social and behavioral change is not trained in this yet. They will be eventually, I'm sure, because of how powerful this paradigm really is. But the potential for impact in the social and behavioral change sphere that cultural evolutionists can make is, I think, really unlimited. And there's enormous opportunity for applied work that is essential, that involves things like reducing infant mortality and increasing people's willingness to get vaccinated. I mean, there's enormous amount of global challenges that require the theoretical and methodological toolkit of cultural evolution.
Yeah, that's really excellent. Not the like, because I am from India, I know that I've experienced some of that. Like I know this whole thing with trying to prevent open defecation in the country. They use simple like behavioral, like topical behavioral changes like nudging, etc., to kind of
Yes.
create these changes, and just creating bathrooms in everyone's houses without understanding. Um, Disgust comes into play, how caste comes into play.
It's a perfect example of how the road to hell is paved with good intentions and
Exactly.
insufficient understanding of the complexity of human nature and
Absolutely.
human culture. This is, I guess, why I call that behavioral economics. And I don't mean to be overly critical, because I
Yeah,
actually am a huge fan of behavioral economics.
absolutely.
But this is one of the ways in which things can go. When you need a whole toolbox, you're never going to succeed with one tool. And we're so enamored with these quick fixes and the nudging and things of that sort. And there's some power to these kind of clever insights about the human mind. But social and behavioral change almost always requires a multi-pronged, a much more, frankly, sophisticated approach. And if you don't understand the full system, you don't know how to intervene most effectively. And yeah, the hygiene is one of the most fascinating topics.
Yeah.
And truly, not enough people understand how fascinating hygiene is, because it gets to your point about disgust and contamination, parts of our deeply functional, evolved psychology that has profoundly complex and fascinating cultural manifestations. I read some fascinating research out of the London School of Tropical Hygiene, and it was really about the disconnect between when you wash your hands. So you're much more likely to wash your hands before you consume food than after you use the toilet, which psychologists can can explain why that is. But there's so much that's really fascinating about understanding those kind of what seem to be disconnects, inconsistencies, but in fact are very predictable, and should really direct where we put our interventional efforts, I think.
Absolutely. Like you're saying, because both of us exist within the field of cultural evolution, it totally makes sense why people would wash hands before consuming food, because, disgust. And
Yeah. And that we're not disgusted by ourselves, right? So and you, boy, do you learn about so many of these not inconsistencies, but these examples when you have a child, things that would be horrifyingly disgusting to you if any
give
other
me an
person did
example.
them
Give me
with
an
your
example.
own child. Just sneezing right into your open mouth, I don't know, for example. I mean, that happened this morning. You tolerate things from your biological offspring
Yeah.
that you would not tolerate from even your own your partner, your
Yeah.
sibling.
Yeah.
There's so many ways in which we treat our own children differently.
Yeah.
And then there's another example, I think, of how powerful cultural evolution is, and well, how evolution by natural selection is more generally, but cultural evolution in particular. There's so much that we have as a field we have to offer, understanding parenting and global cultural variation in parenting, and all of the different fabulously diverse ways in which we can raise well-adjusted children. Right there again, the idea that there's one script, that there's one way to parent that is universally optimal. Right? A lot of the parenting discourse uses language like this. And given what we know about our species and how flexible we are and how diverse we are and how many different cultural ecologies that we occupy, what are the chances there's one optimal way to parent? Zero. 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 It's not the right way to think about parenting, right? And so when students who take my classes in child development, for example, or developmental psychology or cultural evolution, I'll ask them what the goal of parenting is. What do you think they say? What's the goal of
Raise
parenting?
a healthy child.
Sort of. Well, I mean, a lot of these are American students, so they'll say things like to love your child, for your child to be happy, and it's very sweet and very.
Yeah.
So I tell them about cultural evolution. I say, yeah, parents do love their kids, as it turns out. Like it's pretty universal and it's true.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the goal of parenting is to raise a child who will be successful as an adult in whatever cultural context that they will be raised in, like that they are going to live in. That's the goal of parenting. There's not one human context, so there's not one way of parenting. And parents really is another example of how powerful cultural evolution is and how unique it is that parenting responds incredibly rapidly to changing cultural contexts. So in very short periods of time, if you look at, Western Europe, United States, for example, or no need to limit to the United States or Western Europe. If you look at highly educated populations around the world, in the past several decades, parenting has changed dramatically as a result of decreased family size, fewer children, right? All those demographic transitions, because having children and educating children, modern technological economies is very expensive. So people have fewer children and they invest more financial resources in fewer children. So they parent differently, right? Why has parenting become a competitive sport in highly educated populations all over the world, right? In Delhi, in Beijing, in Austin, Texas, right? Because people have fewer children and they're raising them to go to competitive schools and enter globally interconnected competitive economies, right? We don't parent the way that we do 50 years ago or 100 years ago or 150 years ago. So all of that context needs to be, we need to take that into consideration when we start describing, using language, universalist language in talking about parenting.
It's really interesting. And I feel like we've been talking about cultural evolution and cultural variation as like broader terms, and I think we both understand them. But still, for purposes of the audience who may not be in the field of cultural evolution, could you explain what you mean by cultural evolution? What is your understanding of cultural evolution? And yeah, just if you could just give a perspective on it, and then how maybe it plays a role into parenting. And I have a second follow-up question, which you don't have to answer, which is, Asian parenting, because I am from India and I've had Indian parents, and it's particularly harsh, It's a particularly harsh form of parenting. And of course it like sets us up for
It's rigorous.
It's rigorous. Well, yeah, rigorous, harsh, but in a way where it doesn't always lead to like psychologically healthy children, but maybe culturally successful children. And so my question then is the parenting culture, is it still successful parenting? Or with these notions of globalization, do you think this kind of parenting will also need to change? Or just your opinion on that. But maybe let's just start with what you mean by cultural evolution.
Well, okay. So in terms of what I think of as falling under the umbrella of cultural evolution, I mean, the explaining from a functional perspective, using evolutionary theory, how culture changes over time and what's responsible for change, to how to predict change based on, or change in particular outcomes based on changes in particular inputs or context. Culture is use a kind of comparative definition of culture to think about the beliefs and practices and values and norms that constitute the kind of behavioral programming of groups of organisms, right? And of course should limit culture to humans. Many species have culture that we have tremendously underestimated. It's a whole nother, that's a topic for another day. But I think another enormous contribution of cultural evolution is documenting culture in non-human animals in ways that I think has really, really enriched our understanding of non-human animal behavior and cognition, but has also really enriched our understanding of where, from an evolutionary perspective, where culture came from to begin with. And, what sorts of brains do you need to have culture? We used to think that human culture is a product of our giant brains, right? Our giant, powerful brains. But honeybees sure look like they do some cultural things. Non-human animals that don't have brains like ours, cephalopods, for example, do all kinds of brilliant things. So the comparative piece of cultural evolution is another really fascinating space. But back to parenting. I'm happy to talk about that. Yeah.
Back to parenting.
So I think that this is where understanding variation in values is really important, right? So different communities of humans they emphasize different things to different degrees, right? So all humans are capable of all values and all emotions, good and bad, positive and negative balance. And I think there's variation in what is prioritized. So as I mentioned, my very sweet US undergraduates who think that the goal of parenting is to raise happy children. That is, I don't know if you've followed the psychological well-being literature with American young people, but there have been it's been kind of a rocky go for young people from a mental health perspective, right?
I mean, I heard the antidepressants were on the rise, but then I didn't know if it was like a pharmaceutical.
So raising your children in a manner that involves protecting them from all hardship and removing all obstacles and trying to prevent all forms of distress, although the intention I think is probably really is positive. As it turns out, it's important for children to experience some adversity and challenge and to develop some resiliency and, take on challenges where you will fail some portion of the time. So learning how to manage frustration and manage disappointment and manage failure in some cases is part of the psychological toolkit that's necessary to survive in all contexts, right? So some of that, maybe that rough parenting, that rigorous parenting,
Rigorous
might in
parenting.
fact do a bit of a better job building resiliency, right? So when I have students who come into my classes and are completely devastated that they got a B minus in the American marking system, but or a C plus, which is an average mark. And these are students at an elite university and have clearly not had enough experience with this. So when they come to me devastated and fearful that, does this mean I'm not smart? Does this mean I'm not good enough for this major, or whatever the case is? My reaction to that is always, you have been insufficiently challenged. People have not done you a service in your prior educational training of having enough challenge where that you're not always at the top, right? If you're always at the top, you're just not getting challenged enough. It's not that you're the best, unfortunately. Unfortunately, darn it.
Sad reality.
Yes, it is a sad reality. But learning that, challenge just means that or failure means that you need to redouble your efforts, you need to work harder, you need to get more resources, you need to get some advice, etc. It doesn't mean that you're not smart enough and not good enough, and that you should be paralyzed by this experience. So there are pros and cons of different types of parenting approaches, but you can be too soft on the parenting front, as it turns out. Insufficiently prepare your children for what can be a harsh world out there, right? So
Yay, thank you to my parents.
Defend your parents a little bit.
Yeah, I have changed my whole opinion on my whole childhood. I'm like, thank you to my parents. One
You're
conversation.
welcome. You're welcome.
Yes,
Always
no,
happy to help.
thank you so much, Cristine. Oh my God, who needs
My work here
therapy?
is done.
Yeah, calling the therapist. Like, goodbye. Okay, excellent. This is a great conversation. So let's come back to your work in Bihar. Could you maybe elaborate some of these health rituals that these mothers
Sure.
engage in,
Sure.
and that allow them to succeed and allow their young ones to succeed in that cultural context? And
Right.
do you think the not to use the word invasion, because I am a huge fan of allopathy and Western medication, being as Westernized as I am, but kind of this invasion of Western medication, Western practices, does it disrupt cultural norms, cultural practices to a point that it, to a degree, destabilizes mechanisms that have been in place to survive better?
Well, I think that there's the possibility that can happen. I think that we are just beginning to do the kind of research necessary to even answer questions of that sort. So my approach to research of this kind is to understand what currently exists and to understand how people use these systems and not focus so much on how we imagine that they should. Because people are creative and are very pragmatic problem solvers, and they do use different health systems in diverse ways for different reasons. So one advantage of biomedicine is that usually, in some cases, the discoveries are the result of the scientific process. They're not always, by the way. There are plenty of discoveries that are associated with biomedicine that are accidental, that are happenstance, that are kind of happy accidents, right? There's also a lot of biomedical recommendations where we still don't know the mechanism, where we widely prescribe medications that we don't fully understand, not just for physical health, but also for mental health. So it's very much a work in process and should be ideally integrated with practices that already exist. So when I started this project, I met with several doctors, medical doctors, MDs, who thought that the objective of this project was for me to document all of the silly, superstitious things that people were doing in these contexts. That's what they thought I was doing. And so they basically wanted to know, like, well, tell us the ignorant things that people are engaging in, with the assumption that these were harmful, right? And so this is where cultural evolution comes in. If practices have persisted over long periods of time, the chances that they are overtly harmful are fairly small. I'm not saying it never happens. I'm saying it doesn't happen very often. So if these practices have been, people are spending their time and effort and resources engaging in these practices, they have some functionality. There's no way that they don't. So a big part of what we did is just documented them and then categorized them based on whether they were consistent with biomedical recommendations, neutral concerning biomedical recommendations, because they can be neutral, right? or harmful. And only a very tiny portion were harmful, very tiny. And in fact, some of these, like not putting any ointment on the umbilical cord stump, when my brothers were born, and they're 7 and 9 years younger than me, in California, they were recommending that you put ointment on the umbilical cord stump. So these are the biomedical recommendations they change. And currently the recommendation is to leave it dry, is to not put in ointment. But from an intuitive folk medical perspective, this isn't a wound. Putting an ointment on there is very reasonable practice. This isn't a kind of wild, eccentric idea. So the current recommendation is not to put anything on there. And the, traditional folk medical recommendation is to put some sort of medical ointment tincture on there. So this is a relatively minor inconsistency with biomedical recommendations. Most are consistent or neutral concerning biomedical recommendations. And a lot of them, I would say all of them, are doing important social and psychological work in these communities. They're reducing anxiety, as it turns out. Having an organism growing inside your body that is at risk of all sorts of negative outcomes can be very anxiety provoking. So a lot of them are doing a lot of that social psychological work, which biomedicine is not great at, has not been designed to do. And that is where I think the integration of these different health systems would be really very, very beneficial indeed. Many of these practices are rooted in religion, various religious beliefs, which have their own social and psychological functionality. So behavior is hard enough to change if it's harmful. If we're attempting to change behaviors that in fact are not harmful and in fact have important functionality, we're going to talk about waste of time and resources and energy. We need to understand these systems well enough to know where to intervene, if at all, right? Most of these practices are doing absolutely no harm at all. And doing things like, for example, segregating a woman after she gives birth from her extended family and from her normal cooking and cleaning responsibilities. I see this enormous functionality associated with that, right? If she's in a safe and comfortable environment and is given an opportunity to recover physically from the birth process and has additional support from extended family members to care for her baby, this seems like a well-designed system to me. Again, assuming that this is a comfortable and safe and hygienic space and that she's supported. Of course, those caveats are really critical, but there are a lot of practices that have evolved that have really important health benefits to mother and child.
Yeah. This is really, really deeply fascinating because I love that there's all this research coming from my country. And I'm like, I didn't actually know that because I'm from Bombay. So I'm really
lovely. Well, there are tremendous research opportunities to be done there. And I think actually one of my favorite collaborations of my career is with it's a global development organization called Project Concern International India. And they're based in Delhi and have been, absolutely essential partners in this research and are just a brilliant team of practitioners and scientists who are just doing world game-changing applied research. So there's lots of opportunities for people interested in these topics to do, I think, really essential critical work in India and elsewhere.
Yeah. Well, shout out to the team in India.
Yeah.
The point I'm making is that because I'm from Bombay and it's modernized or technologically advanced that we don't actually have any of these practices that you've probably come across.
This is another reason we have to study cultural evolution, because with gain comes loss, right? And we live in an era, there's a lot of focus on all of the gains associated with modern technology and education and insufficient attention to cultural, really the universe of beliefs and practices and behaviors and norms and values and languages, knowledge, belief systems that are being lost. And you can't have it all, right? It's very, very challenging to maintain, right? The story of human history is one of change, and that does involve loss, right? And that does involve some hard loss, and there isn't enough attention paid to what we are losing while we are gaining.
No, that's honestly really beautiful. Like the only thing I can think of like even close to that is like after my mom gave birth to both me and my brother, she went and stayed with her parents for a good month or so. That's that's the only thing that I know that's similar. So, Puente, can you maybe, this is so fascinating. Could you maybe give a few examples on some rituals that were helpful and in line with the medical recommendations, and some that were not, they were neutral, but maybe had like social functions? So, like, they fulfilled some social or mental health functions, which is why they're being
Well,
practiced.
sure. So maybe some of the beneficial rituals have to do with they're many, but have to do with nutrition and the preparation of special foods that are healing. And there's one of the many absurdities of working in this space is the number of Western-based nutritional interventions in India, which is one of the great cuisines, not singular, many, many thousands of cuisines in India. I think uncontroversial to say the cuisine is the best, among the very best and most sophisticated and most nutritious in the world. And yet there are a large number of nutritional interventions that are happening in India right now that are based and funded by the West that involve things like, this is a good dietary choice, from countries that eat Big Macs and French fries and things of this sort.
It's actually really insane that you
It's
say this.
fascinating and insane, and truly insane. A culture that is largely vegetarian, uses diverse spices with all of these incredible health benefits,
Yeah.
knows how to cook plant protein well, and Americans are
Actually,
teaching them about
I should,
diet.
I should, I should correct you. We're not largely vegetarian. That's a misconception.
Well, in many regions, in many
In
regions
many
of
regions,
India,
in many regions, but it's a very like
in many regions.
cost-based. That's another thing that I was
Fair
I
enough.
was looking at, like on Instagram. I get a lot of these recommendations. Like, have you seen all these men with pot bellies, like Indian men with pot bellies? Do you wonder why it is? And it's because they have this diet has like that's high in carbohydrate and like low in protein and da da da, because it's a vegetarian diet. And then I and then I'm like, no, that's untrue. Many societies are not vegetarian, or even so in like different parts, like caste plays a really important role. So like the upper castes would possibly be vegetarian and the lower castes wouldn't. But anyway, like, and I think it's exactly this kind of misconception, right? Like not the one that what you've spoken about, but what I saw on the Instagram
It's
reels and
true.
in the TikTok.
It's true. Well, and you can eat very unhealthy food and be vegetarian.
Yeah, you
I
can.
mean, French fries are vegetarian, right? So it's a complex, I mean, it's a great illustration of just like, contamination and hygiene and things like that. Diet is a fascinating way to understand culture, cultural change, right? People are not eating are not eating ancestral diets anymore, right? As communities are exposed to more and more industrialized ways of living, they're eating more processed foods, they're eating more imported foods, they're eating fattier foods, and they're eating all the foods that are full of fat, sugar, and the things that we have evolved taste preferences for, right? It's not a challenge to get people to enjoy sugary, fatty foods. Babies immediately love these foods. It doesn't require any training at all. So when these foods flood into communities, including communities that have traditionally had very healthy diets, you can go from very healthy to very unhealthy immediately. I mean, really incredibly, incredibly, incredibly quickly. I think it's important to understand nuance, as you point out, but it's also really important to focus to attend to the fact that there's nothing certain in human culture
No,
than,
no,
nothing more certain than change. And there's always change occurring. We're never static. So we've got to be looking ahead instead of, I think, focusing on inaccurate and dated caricatures of India
cultures. Yeah,
or the US or anywhere. I mean, that's another thing we need to stop doing, is acting as though cultures are nation states or they're interchangeable. I mean, you work in places like the US or India, this becomes even more absurd. Right? These are immensely, immensely diverse and complex places where northern Bihar and Bombay they're different universes.
literally. I was like, oh,
They are. They absolutely are different universes, and they happen to be part of the same nation
country.
state. But that would be the only thing that those, communities have in common. And there are, I mean, I think, very strong arguments to be made that communities in, some communities in Bombay and some communities in Austin, Texas have more in common than those communities in Bombay and the communities in rural communities in Bihar that we've worked with. So we need to move away from these, in some ways, sort of uninformative cultural, groups that are not that culturally meaningful in some respects.
To have an arch nemesis in academia, it would be anyone that promotes dichotomies. Like it's an individualistic culture versus it's a collectivistic culture. And I'm like, okay, but like it doesn't, that's not how it works.
That
Like it's
was
just,
that was I mean, our in psychology, our understanding of culture was so primitive at one point. I promise you that was insightful.
I
It's
know.
not anymore. But I'm just saying that just shows you how low bar truly was. In some
Yeah.
respects is still is. I mean, this is the siloing of the social scientific disciplines where anthropology was sort of assigned culture and
Mhm.
psychologists, I mean, to this day, many, maybe most don't think they study culture. You can't study humans and not study culture. Maybe you don't study it well because you don't even know you need to study it. But it has really been it's been very, very detrimental, I think. And because this is not how humans operate, right? There's no
Absolutely.
sociology module and anthropology module. And so it's just like and yet you create these distinctions and people invest in them as though they're meaningful in some way, which is another tremendous strength of cultural evolution, is that there's a recognition that academia happens to be divided into disciplines, but most of the people working in cultural evolution work between them, which is why I initially got interested in cultural evolution. I was always interested in evolutionary theory, but trying to figure out how do I create an intellectual home or join an intellectual home that isn't defined by traditional disciplines. Cultural evolution was it. And just seeing how much it's growing and how successful it's been and I think it's just gotten started. As I say, the potential for making contributions to applied social science is just social behavioral change is just, we've just gotten started.
I'm so excited. Yeah. And that's so true. And this whole conversation highlights why cultural evolution as a field is so important because it finally allows us to see cultures in terms of the nuances that they offer instead of just these static things, static,
Things,
yeah, which they're not. It's a relational dynamic. And it's really funny. We were talking about like diet and dietary practices, and this is like I'll probably edit this out, maybe not. We'll see how it goes. But just thinking about how much my dietary practices have adapted simply to the environment that I live in. Like, of course, when I'm at home, I'm studying in New Zealand right now, but when I'm at home, I only eat Indian food and we have like roti, we have vegetables, we have rice, dal. That's the whole complete like meal. And you have to have that every day. And then I've come here and I mean, partially because I'm not the best cook, but also because like things are so differently accessible in like grocery stores. Stuff like pasta is so much more accessible than like all of these spices and everything that I need to make Indian food. And the other thing is like kind of individualistic living. So I speak to my grandmother often on the weekends and she's like, what have you eaten? And I'd be like, pasta. And she's like, why? Why don't you learn to make rotis? And I'm like, you're not going to make rotis for one person.
me. Yeah.
But so it's like the
That's a
whole
lot of effort. Yeah.
whole
Yeah.
way in which one can be like, oh, I've become individualistic now. But it's really it's me adapting to the culture that I am living in right
Which
now.
is required, right? Remember, I was doing some field work in Vanuatu, which is where we've done field work there for more than
Where
a
is that?
decade now. But it's Vanuatu is about 5 hour flight from Auckland. In
Okay.
fact,
Okay.
so it's near Fiji. It's an archipelago in a Melanesian archipelago, and we were doing field work there for the first time. And I was getting to know, some, the local population, and I was having this conversation with some women, and I had my first flat, like my own apartment,
Yeah.
no roommates.
Yeah.
I'd finally arrived, and I was just delighted by this. And I was mentioning, oh, I got my own flat, and they looked at me and they said, "You live by yourself?" And I said, "Yeah, I live by myself. Yeah, isn't it great?" And they were like, "Oh, I'm so sorry." They were, "Where's your family?" They were so concerned, and they're already really concerned that wasn't, not married. I didn't have children at that point. We're like, you live alone, you have no husband, no children, your family doesn't live in the same city. Like they were ready to do a full-on intervention on me. They were so, I could see their faces. They were alarmed. This was not a success story at all from their
No,
perspective. And it was just, this isn't one of the many reasons that I do cultural comparison. And I think it's so powerful. You learn as much about yourself and your own culture as you do about the population that you're working with, and things you just assume are totally normal or just a product of the particular context that you live in. It's so,
yeah,
what an incredibly important insight to have. But they were concerned.
yeah,
This is not like Cristine the success story. It was very much
no.
like,
Are you
honey,
okay?
we need to talk.
That's so funny. Yeah, 100%. It's really random, not connected at all. But like, I could never live alone. I know so many of my friends aspire to have like a flat of their own or a house of their own, and I'm like, I would rather die than live in a
It's
house without
hard.
flatmates.
I don't recommend it. And there's something that's just that's a cultural construction. We're not wired up for solitary living, right? I mean, our brains are wired up for social living, for social group living. This is a core feature of our fundamental nature. So we can adapt to living in these contexts, but is this psychologically healthy? Might this be associated with mental health crises that we're having on like national scales at this point? I could be. I think perhaps could be.
Possibly.
I think there
Yeah.
might be a relation there, right? So we are capable of adapting to things that aren't necessarily good for us or natural, or part of healthy human thriving. That's a reality, right?
No, that's so true. I mean, I feel like we've moved away from your research, but now I'm just like reminiscing. A friend of mine moved from the States and she's moved here and she's like moved out of her family home. Like, and she's like, I don't have a place to go back to in the States. And I'm like, what do you mean? Like, to me, it's like, my parents' house will always be my house. Like, I'll never actually move away. And it's really funny. My mom has actually told my brother, she's like, even if you get married, we're all going to live together. We're not going to live separately. Like, it's all random, but like being here, I feel the pressure to be like, no, but like I'm a fully functioning adult. I'm not a loser. Just like, I just live with my parents back at home. So anyway,
there's nothing, I can't imagine anything greater than that. Now that I have a child, he wants to live with me until my dying day. Completely okay with that. Totally get the advantage of that. So
yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, this is, it's I think a very telling illustration of different priorities, different values, and different kinds of strengths, right? And there's a tremendous strength associated with an extended family. And there's lots of reasons why that kind of familial structure has evolved. And it's also the case that different kinds of cultural institutions and different kinds of family setups are good and bad, right? Can be good socially, could be very bad for individual psychology. There's a lot that's evolved culturally that's great for groups and bad for individuals.
yeah. Actually,
That's a reality.
maybe if I can poke your brain on this, which is I always now that I've learned cultural evolution a lot more, I just find that having extended families, having family support, it's almost so natural because alloparenting really takes the pressure off of the individual. It gives, like shares responsibility and stuff like that. And like there's like extra resources that are provided to the child. Whereas
Yeah,
nuclear parenting is kind of contradictory to this
totally.
survival thing.
It's a
And so I
product
wonder
of
why.
changing
Sorry.
economies.
So can you like
Changing
shed some light
economies.
on it? Like why has it become so
Yeah.
popular?
So
Why?
one, family size has fallen, right, for economic reasons, right, demographic reasons. There's really fascinating cultural evolutionary research on this. And as people have smaller and smaller families, have fewer and fewer children, smaller families, that's part of it. The globalized workforce requires relocation. Case in point,
Yeah, yeah.
neither
Me?
one of us are in cities we were born in.
Yeah.
In fact, neither of us are anywhere near. We're not even on the
Well,
same side of the planet. I'm
really,
from
where were you
Alaska
born? Are you
originally.
really?
Yes. So neither one of us are in the same location we were born in or anywhere near, right? And that's a product of our participation in the the industrialized, educational, economic, global
Right.
industry. So that has driven people away from their extended families. And it has made child rearing much, much, much more difficult. And there's absolutely no question. Again, going back to Vanuatu, where I did my field work, that first trip, I was kind of naively asking these women questions about, oh, one of them had just had a baby very recently. And I said, oh, you must be so tired. You just had this baby. And she's like, I mean, not really. Wow. You say that to women in cities we live in. They're like, yeah, I'm about to
Exhausted.
fall down right in
Yeah.
my, like right here. I'm so exhausted. I'm not even fluent in my mother tongue right now. Right. And then, she explained to me that she's got her mother-in-law, her sisters, several of her older children, her nieces, all in their immediate proximity. And so she can nap during the day. And she does have an opportunity, she's not driving in a car to a job across the city. She's surrounded by an extended family that all assist with child rearing, right? So it's really clarified to me how difficult we have made having babies and having families because the economy has not caught up. We see these kinds of disconnects all the time, right? Has not caught up with the kind of support that's required. So again, just there are trade-offs, and we have a long way to go to figure out how to support women in participating in the workforce and caring for children, not just women, but families. We have a lot of work to do. Some countries more than others. New Zealand's much farther ahead than the US on this front. That's for
I
sure.
think so, yeah. I think it's because of the Maori and Pacifica culture that's dominant here in that regard. I think this is so interesting. And this may be a selfish question, and this probably is unrelated again. And it's such a fascinating conversation, is that because you've done fieldwork in so many different countries, and I think you've just highlighted how our I mean, pre-existing notions of certain concepts, for example, childbearing and child rearing is extremely exhausting, whereas for someone in your field site, it wasn't. How do you go ahead and do field work without bringing in these assumptions into place, without asking questions that are culturally insensitive or not culturally um,
Well, I mean, I think that doing a lot of listening is really helpful. And I think that people are also incredibly tolerant of naivete. They certainly have been very tolerant of my naive questions, right? So I think that that people recognize when your intentions are good, and they are extremely forgiving when you take the time and effort to be corrected and to learn and to listen and to revise misconceptions and learn from that. I think that there's a lot of tolerance for that, where people understand that other communities do things differently. When first went to Vanuatu, and I mentioned that I was interested in how they raise children, I remember one of the women said, well, we do it the best way. You can do it. The idea that I would be there to learn from them, they're like, yeah, that checks out. We have much to teach you.
yeah.
You know,
Suffering. Sit down.
so they're like, yeah, we have things to show you. And the first thing we need to fix is you living alone and not being married and not having any children when you clearly
Yeah,
have been, went through puberty quite some time ago. We need to fix some things for you. You've come to the right place.
we'll tell you.
So you go in there with a, humble spirit and are willing to listen and willing to revise misconceptions. I've changed my mind about so many things through fieldwork and through learning and listening and living with people. This is one of the, I think, tremendous strengths of anthropology, is doing fieldwork long enough that you actually have the time to establish meaningful relationships with other people. This is, it's a challenge for most psychologists doing this kind of work, is we tend not to stay for long enough to really build these kinds of relationships. So figuring out how to really connect, because that's when these insights really come in. Yes, you can do structured surveys and learn some of this, but a lot of the insights I've just described to you were living there for several months and having long conversations and learning Bishlama, at least well enough to have conversations, which is, largely English based. So it's not that much of an accomplishment, but still putting enough effort in to have to have a basis for mutual understanding. I think that's the secret sauce. And I don't think
Yeah.
you have to worry tremendously about being wrong, because you will be wrong. If you've come to the conclusion that you are not wrong about a lot of things, you have not listened enough. Just like I said about my undergraduates panicking over a C, right? That doesn't mean you're the best or the most brilliant. It just means you've not been adequately challenged in the past. So yeah, I guess that'd be my advice in doing field work.
That's Really lovely. And so with that, I know we're short on time, so I'm gonna ask you two questions, just fun questions. One, maybe could you, if you're comfortable with it, share like a faux pas that you had on field?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. So again, in Vanuatu, so there was having this conversation with a young mother, and I had read the anthropological literature about cultural variation in motherese. And I was asking her about whether she talked to her baby, like how much she talked to her baby. And she looked at me and she said, "You know, they can't talk at this age, right?"
For surely I talk to dogs.
The idea that you have an infant, a pre-verbal infant, is a conversational partner. And by the way, you talking to dogs is crazy. I talk to dogs. But this is a crazy thing we do in some cultures. This is not the fact that we treat our dogs like humans. I will go down the street in Austin and I will see these little dogs, these little designer,
Yeah.
whatever, huggy situations in strollers. There's no baby in that stroller. There's a dog in that stroller, right? That is crazy.
Okay. A great cultural perspective.
I've got two border collies. I talk to them, we have conversations. They love eye contact. We've bred them to like eye contact and do that. So again, I'm not criticizing. I'm just pointing out
Yeah. That it is bizarre.
that she's reminding me that treating a baby who cannot respond as a conversational partner is kind of a strange thing to do, right? And infants overhear tons of speech. They do talk to them, but they don't talk to them in this kind of conversational way to the
Did you
same
enjoy this? Did
extent.
you enjoy this?
Right. Do you
Yeah.
enjoy this? Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Right. And then answering for them,
Yeah. Yeah.
again, which is another example of how just showing the lens being turned and showing something that isn't even questioned in your own, community, just giving it a different, seeing it a different light.
That is hilarious. This conversation has been so fun because I've just realized that I'm crazy talking to my dogs
Join the club. Also crazy. Also
together.
crazy. Also have conversations with dogs. The other faux pas was when I was doing some field work in Jordan when I was in college, and there were tons of cats around, and I was missing my cat very much.
Yeah.
And so there was this cat that was, hanging out on the side of the village. And I went over and I was talking to the cat and petting the cat. And the villagers I was with looked at me like I was like petting a chair or something. It was so, what are you doing? I mean, they respect cats. Cats catch rodents, like they do useful things. But here I was like having this conversation with this, oh, little kitty cat, making cat sounds like, oh, this woman is Looney Tunes. Whereas in Auckland or in Austin, no one would, they would join me. They would come in and have a little, you would join me, see?
I would join you. Exactly.
So crazy.
Yeah. 100%. No, this happens to me. I get that a lot. Like every time I see like a stray dog, I want to pet a stray dog. So we were just in Bali for a conference and I was with my colleagues from there. I was like, oh my God, I want to pet stray dogs. They're like, do they have germs? And I'm like, no, they don't. They're lovely. I mean, anyway.
This is tremendous fun. What a delight to meet you.
I know. I'll just leave you with one last promotional question, which is, why do you think people should join CES, which is the Cultural Revolution Society? What benefit will they get from it?
Well, I mean, obvious benefits like learning about exciting cutting edge research in this field, learning about new, sort of theoretical innovations, but also one of the things I most enjoy is learning about all the brilliant and creative methods that people are using, because we're not constrained to just one discipline. So we're borrowing from cognitive anthropology, evolutionary anthropology, experimental psychology, sociology, demography. To me, it's just like an opportunity to really build your toolkit and to get really, really creative ideas about how to do science and also to do, to learn about, like I said, applied science. A lot of like the social and behavioral change work. I am far from the only person in the field who is doing work of this sort. So there are really opportunities, I think, to bridge the basic applied divide.
Yeah. No, great answer. I'm going to use that as a little snippet for like Instagram Reels and TikToks.
Sounds great.
Come join us. Anyway, thank you so much, Cristine, for this lovely, lovely conversation. This has been so delightful. And thank you for your time. See you soon. Okay.
That's great.